you're talking about a people, and again, this is why I spent so much time on why it's harder for Americans to kind of really understand this. It's because of our historical experience with just demographic turnover.
Right.
We kind of have this idea, even though we're being pushed to our limits right now, and you're really starting to see that because of the ideological forces and the cultural forces that are making it much, much harder to swallow and digest the current crop of new immigrants since 1965, much harder to assimilate for various reasons. So we're approaching our limit here, but we still have this kind of idea in America that, these things are going to happen and then we'll figure it out and renegotiate, and kind of America will be different. But, in another generation or two, more change will be happening. And that's just, the dynamic of the United States. And so we always have this sort of feeling that in terms of our collective identity, like we'll figure it out. You go to a place like, any European nation where this is a people's ancient homeland. And there's actually such thing as, an Englishman. There's such thing as that. Like an American is something that, again, the definition of it changes with every generation, and it's always been that way. The definition of an Englishman has never changed, and it never will change. And those people, the English people,
not for over 1,000 years, not since 1066.
Right. And so, those people they're in the process right now of forever losing the only spot of land that they have on this earth that is dedicated to the flowering and the preservation of the English people. Like, and it's a tiny little spot.
It's true for the Dutch. It's true for the Spanish. It's true for the Germans. It's true for the Belgians. It's true for every Western European nation. So why not have a Nuremberg trial for the people who did that? I don't understand. I mean, that's such a crime.
Well, we have to win first.
Yeah. But I just think it's important to say out loud that that's a crime.
It's
an
inconceivable
hundreds of millions of people.
If you go back to bring up like Louis XIV or any powerful monarch, they never would have dared imagine that they could do that to their people without getting their head cut off. They wouldn't have dared imagine that they could just replace their people with, people from a different continent, different religion, different language, just to overwhelm them, to make their own people a minority in that country for whatever reason, ideological, economic, whatever it was. They wouldn't imagine that they had the right, the power, the ability to do that, And I said something to you yesterday when we were having dinner that I would probably feel somewhat differently about this if it was a situation where, over the last 8 generations of English people, of British people, that they had just sort of like gradually brought people in from around the world. And over the course of 200 years or 300 years, they had just transformed the demography of their island into something unrecognizable. Because you could look at that and say, well, I don't necessarily think that's the best idea for them, or, I don't like the changes that are being made. But hey, the English people, they made this decision over the course of 200 years.
Exactly. It's like their food. I won't eat their food. It's disgusting, but they like it, and that's okay.
But this one generation decided that they had no responsibility to any of the people who came before them, and they have no responsibility to any of the people who are coming after them. They are going to permanently, radically, irreparably transform their society in ways that they know hurt the majority of the population. They've immunized themselves from, at present, but that they know are not welcome and are harmful to the majority of the people that they rule over. And one generation of people decided that they had the right to do that. And
it's the post-war generation. It's the generation born in 1946, between 1946 and 1964. That's who did that.
Yep.
So it's hard to escape the obvious conclusion, and I suspect this is part of what's driving your current project, that war didn't just redraw borders, but it changed the world in ways that are still unfolding, and that whose like profound nature we're only now beginning to appreciate. Is that right?
Sure. I'm a big fan of the writer René Girard, right? He talks about, he's got this whole big theory about the origin of human religion and sacrificial ritual and stuff. But putting aside like his broader speculations about the origin of religion, one of the things he talks about is if you look through the myths of every society you can pretty much think of throughout history, if you look at like the national origin stories of any nation or people that you can think of, it is almost without exception, and it may be without exception, that there's blood at the beginning of that story. And it's framed, because it's a sacred story, it's framed as sacrificial blood, right? And now sometimes, like, he'll give examples of,
that is true.
He'll give examples of sometimes, there's his basic theory, right, is that when a society finds itself in a time of tremendous turmoil, and it may be just disunion, or like people can feel like we have right now, since like 2015 or however long it's been, there's just this tension where people kind of, moderate people, regular people that aren't typically political, right and left for that matter, everybody kind of has this feeling that this can't just keep going the way it's going. Like, we're approaching some sort of a point where decisions are going to have to be made, confrontations are going to have to occur, and a decision is going to have to be made because there's just too much ambivalent energy pulling us in every direction. People feel it in their daily lives, and and so that starts to happen to a society. And he points to all these examples throughout history and ancient mythology, right, where he'll talk about how there's some problem that was, a plague is plaguing Thebes, and whatever example you want to give. And they find the scapegoat person for this, and Jonah being thrown overboard into the sea, to calm the storm. And what do you know? We found the culprit, we found the perpetrator, the one who had like brought this curse upon the city because of his own private sin or whatever it was, and we got rid of that person, and now everything is actually better. And now the plague went away and the storm stopped and something. And so what Girard says is this is a very interesting insight, I think, is he says what these all are, these are post hoc apologias for what these people did.
Exactly.
They're looking back and saying that, this person who we murdered, that we had to do that, but then there's another little weird dynamic where that person sort of becomes deified, because at the end of the day, they did have the power to restore order and peace to the society, to make the plague go away. And there's also a sort of ambivalent feeling, because somewhere in there, they do know that they murdered this person as a scapegoat. And so he gives an example, by the way, of like, obviously he talks about the Christian story, the crucifixion. And he says, you have a time like where this is like Jerusalem was full of revolutionary ferment. There were rebel leaders and riots. There were messiahs cropping up saying that they were going to lead a resistance against the Romans. It was a very, very, very tense time. And the Jewish community in Jerusalem was able to sort of go through this process of uniting around the need to eliminate this victim who, at least at present, is like responsible and emblematic of all of the mounting insanity that's sort of engulfing us all right now. And the difference, though, and why Christianity is what it is, like you think about the idea that we have the cross as our symbol, which is so strange to people who are not Christians. It's like for people today, you would have to think about, like, for the visceral sort of way that somebody in the Roman world would have witnessed that, would have seen that, it would be like your religious symbol was like a corpse hanging from a noose.
Exactly. Or a meat hook.
Yeah, right. And so like that's what they would have seen. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, wow, what is going on there? Like your God came down and he was murdered and tortured, put up on a cross, and that's like your sacred symbol of him. You're not trying to forget that part of the story or sort of pretend that didn't happen. That is the story. Very strange, right? And it's because this process that every myth, Girard says, was based on throughout history, that you see apologized for and rationalized in every one of these myths. There were people who were following Jesus who refused to go along. And they said, no. He was innocent and you murdered him. And they refused to back down from that. And you look like in the book of Acts, when Stephen gets martyred, they freak out and stone him, not when he's making doctrinal points. It's when he gets to the point, he says, you murdered him. He accuses them of murder and they stone him for it. And you had these people who were willing to die for that. They were willing to stand with the victim of, this mob attack, of this scapegoat attack, and die with him if necessary. Because, to a Christian, like, that's what martyrdom means. It's different than like what a Muslim means by it usually, right? You can go to war and die in war and you're a martyr, like in the Muslim world, which is fine. Like, they have their way of looking at things. But to a Christian, it doesn't mean you're dying for an idea, dying for Christ. It means you're willing to die with Christ. If you see a mob picking up stones and surrounding an innocent victim, you're not going to slink away. You're not going to pick up stone. And if you do, then, then you're making an irreparable, sort of irrevocable choice at that point. You are going to stand with that person against the mob, even if it means that you die with him. That's what it means. And if everybody does that, then you have a transformed society and the kingdom of God is here. And so as a counterexample, Girard uses a holy man, late first century, early second century, called Apollonius of Tyana. And he was a pagan holy man who they constructed a biography for him that is essentially the same as Jesus. Virgin birth, born in a manger, 12 disciples, eventually died and was brought back to life. And so it's a clear ideological refutation of this growing Christian myth that's starting to take over the pagan world. And one of his most famous miracles that he performed was there was a plague that was engulfing the city of Ephesus. And nobody knows what to do. And so they call up Apollonius of Tyana. You got to help us with this plague. And so he goes up there and he says, okay, I'll help you, but you have to agree ahead of time. You do exactly what I tell you to do. They say, okay, great, just help us. And so he leads the community to this town square. And there's this old beggar who is, raggedy clothes, filthy, no teeth. He's just a destitute, broken, old beggar. And he tells the people around, he says, now pick up stones, kill that man. And at first they're like, I don't know about this little word. And he's like, you want a plague to continue or not? Kill that man. And so one stone flies, and as soon as one flies, two fly, and then their whole thing. And so they cover him, they stone him to death. And he's covered with a cairn of stones, essentially. And as they're stoning him, his eyes flash red and he bares his teeth and they realize it's a demon. And so they finish him off. And at the end, they clear away the stones. And what they find is this giant frothing at the mouth, dog demon thing. And then the plague goes away. And what Girard says, or he doesn't put it this way because this is a little too provocative for him, but I'll put it this way. What you're reading there is the story of the crucifixion as it would have been written from the perspective of the Pharisees. That's what that is.